Great. Thanks, Dave. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for your commitment to Giants today and hopefully throughout the year. I'm Rebecca Bush. I work at Ottawa Area ISD. We are the home of Giants. And along with me today, who you're going to hear from in just a few minutes, we have Dr. Phil Gershmel. We have Dave Johnson and Roy Sovis, my partners in crime, right? And so without further ado, I'm going to tackle questions as we go through tonight, but you all should have, in addition to the link, the other pertinent information. Dave did include the SCECH form. Just wanted you to be aware of that for those of you who do want to receive the SCECHs. Anything else? I think we can probably just take care of in a little while. I don't want to waste any of our time. I want to get it to you guys. So thanks, Dave, and take it away.
All right, we start every Giants New Year, and thank you, Becky, for the introduction. We start every new Giants year with just a quick overview of what Giants is and how to access it and how to find it. And I'm going to drop this in the chat, and I'm also going to put it in the running agenda document. But we have a flashy new website. It looks very similar to the old website, just a little more modern. And the website address is ss.oaisd.org. And you can see we've got tabs for all the grade levels, which are now active. They're highlighted. So if you actually move your mouse down to 7th grade Giants, you can see all of the units are live, and we have this pacing view version. So everything is in Google Docs format. We switched it over to a Google shared drive last year. And the only reason I bring that up is because we still get some interesting wonkiness with share settings with stuff that should be wide open that I'm looking at that, I even tested because Becky told me this afternoon she couldn't get into anything yesterday. And so I went in a private incognito window and checked on each one of them, and I could get in perfectly fine. So just know everything's in Google Doc format, and if you have to request access, it does come to multiple people, and we'll get it straightened out. But just know that we've kind of revamped the website, and we'll drill down into some of the nuts and bolts of the actual units and the lessons in just a few minutes. But Giants, I had a bullet here to talk about how Giants is different from everything else. We've had the MC3, the Oakland units, the Mesa units, whatever you call them, they're all the same thing. We've had those out for a long time. And while they have echoes of inquiry-based instruction, Giants was built from the ground up like giant inquiry design models or modules. So we have really been striving to both update the units. Some of you may have participated in the original rollouts X number of years ago, and in pandemic time, that's like 6 decades ago. But really, it was like 4 or 5 years ago that we rolled these out, and we've made some substantial revisions, both to update them for the new content expectations and to enhance, hopefully, the inquiry-based foundation that they are that they're designed around. Every unit, so if I click in here, and again, I'm going to show you more of these in depth as we go, but every unit has a unit overview. And this unit overview, again, looks like one giant IDM template. It's got a compelling question. It's got our grade level. It's got the content expectations that are addressed over the course of the unit. So it's really your 30,000-foot view of what your next few weeks of instruction are going to look like. And then we have individual lessons. And I think the biggest takeaway that I want you guys to leave with is, normally a lot of people see the word lesson and they say, oh, hey, okay, so that's a day in my life in the classroom. But our lessons are generally multi-day, sometimes multi-week. So when you see all of this, you'll kind of understand you don't have to get through every single one of these activities in a day. Although unit 1 was a bad example because unit 1 is a short unit, but My general rule of thumb that I tell people is take the number of weeks from the pacing view that the unit is listed and divide it by however many lessons there are. And that's roughly how long each lesson should approximately take, or how long it should take you to get through the unit as a whole. So with this first unit having 3 lessons and really designed to be done over the space of about 7 to 10 days, that means each lesson is about a day or two before you'll move into unit 2, which is a little bit longer. And then most of them settle into this nice little 6-week routine where you're spending about 2 weeks per lesson. But I just wanted you guys to be aware of both of those things before we even start with any of the Giants rollout tonight. And then the final thing that I wanted to share with you is all over these units, like if I go directly into unit 3 of 7th grade, all over these units, you're going to find links to the Michigan Open Book Project. And this is a project, this is actually it's the sister project to Giants. We developed these books, and then a bunch of teachers said, hey, a bunch of people said, hey, you know what? We really, really, really would like to see lessons and additional resources that go along with them. And Becky Bush was like, hold my beer. And Ottawa Area Intermediate School District took up the charge to build these beautiful Giants units that are freely available to all of you. And they built them around the shell and the framework of the Michigan Open Book Project digital textbooks. Some of you may have used them in the past. Some of you may be seeing them for the first time, but whatever camp you fall into, it doesn't matter, because if you have a textbook that you love, use that instead. We have, we're providing one for you if you need it, but use whatever textbook you have. Just look for, whatever Michigan Open Book Chapter 3 is about. Look for that corresponding chapter or chapters in whatever textbook you may have in your classroom, and you'll be good to go. So that's kind of it for me for the nuts and bolts, the general overview. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. We're already ahead of schedule, which is good, but I'm about to turn it over to Phil, which means that, he will hoover up that time like a rainbow vacuum, which is awesome because he's the real star of the show tonight in particular. So before I turn it over to Phil, any quick questions over the nuts and bolts in the introduction?
I just have a question about share settings, because one of the problems we had with the Oakland ISD units were that students could also access the full amount, and they, so it had no assessments. How do you choose who gets to have access to the documents? You said it triggers the share settings to you guys. How do you determine who gets to have access?
Really good question. Most of the time it's easy to tell because a student is either going to show up as like prancingpony65@gmail.com as requesting access, or they're going to show up as like Freeland S25, which is at schooldistrict.org, which is, generally speaking, good code for me to look at to recognize that that's probably a student account. We don't care if they have access to the units because there's nothing, they're not going to really understand what they're looking at if they go there and we don't have answer keys. But you'll notice the agenda link that I sent out tonight. Bye guys, have fun at dance. My life happens at home, sorry about that. The agenda link that I sent out tonight has a folder link that says assessments. We're never posting that anywhere. So that Google folder that's in the agenda that has assessments isn't going to get posted publicly. And people have to ask for them. And then we get the link to that folder to them. So that's a really good question. Thank you. Normally I do 1 deep breath for wait time, but with online learning, you've got to do 2 deep breaths to give people the chance to find the unmute button. But hearing none, I'm going to turn us over to Dr. Gershmel for a little bit, and he's going to rock your world with some of the brain science behind how all of this is set up. So with that, I'm going to mute and I'm going to stop my video, and I'm going to say it's all you, Phil. Take it away.
This is supposed to be a quick look at the neuroscience about how to use maps to help teach history. And I'm going to start out with a couple sponsors. And it started out with just 2 sponsors, the New York Subway, that gave me a whole lot of time that I really couldn't do anything else but read neuroscience articles. You know, a newspaper was out of the question. Making eye contact is not advisable. So I have to thank the New York subway, ugly as it is. The other sponsor, as of 2 weeks ago, was the Geografia Historia de Sao Paulo. This is one of 4 buildings in the Geography History Education College of the Universidade de Sao Paulo. In other words, Geography History Education employs about 300 faculty members at that university, or roughly 10 times what you would have in a typical American university. Many of them are involved in an international program of assembling research from other countries. So they're my window into the other countries. And like I say, those were my 2 sponsors up until this week. And then the Hettinger report came out. And for you guys that have heard several of this before, let me strongly recommend this Hettinger report. If you're not signed up to it, email me and I'll send you a PDF. They did and released this week a meta-analysis of more than 140 studies involving 80,000 students about what it took to motivate students in remote and hybrid social studies lessons. And the findings are just really interesting. This is a tremendous contribution. And then one day later came my weekly notification from Teachers Discovery, and I have to thank them for reminding me every week about how popular some really crummy curriculum is. Now, I'm not saying that every lesson they come out with is bad. I am saying that enough of them are, and that they don't hang together at all. And that is one of the things we're trying to do a little bit different with Giants. So this thing has 4 parts to it. A 4-minute presentation that is a wake-up call about how kids do visual learning, or if there is such a thing. And then the second thing is about parallel brain networks. This is a kind of a game. And if you guys want to be in on the game, you're going to have to turn your camera on so that you can hold your numbers up in front of your face for this second part here. And then you can tune back out again. Symbol maps and other bad designs is to ask the question about the effectiveness of different kinds of textbook maps. And then finally, some sample activities in curriculum design and how that goes all the way through the Giants curriculum from grade 2 up to grade 8. So with that, a wake-up call. Visual learning. Teachers often use photos or video to provide some basic visual vocabulary. And I did this too. In fact, I used to show about 150 images per lecture at the university. Now, I had to do lectures because I typically had 400 students in the room. In other words, it was a lot like doing a remote lesson. And we needed a lot of visuals. So, hey kids, this is what a rainforest looks like. A rainforest gets lots of rain. It's a forest with big trees in it. And if you live in a rainforest, you're likely to build your house out of wood. Well, hey, kids, this is what a desert looks like. Desert doesn't get very much rain. People are more likely to build their houses out of stone since there aren't any trees around. In other words, the basic principle of geography that underlies 7th grade world geography and history is that how you live in a particular place is influenced by where that place is, what it's like there. So geography part of this is the science is totally obvious. What makes it a little bit challenging is that what's obvious in Michigan is not at all obvious in Malawi or Mexico or Mongolia. So we need pictures. We need lots of well-chosen pictures to build visual vocabulary. But unless we link these to some kind of a map, students aren't going to learn where this is. And if they don't know where it is, they're not going to be able to relate it to anything else in that particular part of the world. And the problem is that maps are more abstract than photos. Here comes my wake-up call. I'm teaching a class of 28 students. And we're live, we're in person. I showed them a picture of the rainforest, and then I said, oh, by the way, this is where the rainforest is. And I added this to the image. And then I showed them some pictures of the desert. And then I said, this is where the desert is. And we got to the end of our little tour of Africa. And I said, you need to study this pattern of environments. We've done it for Africa. We're going to have to do it for the other places. We need to know what Central Asia looks like and so on before we can start talking about the Indo-Europeans. So study this pattern. Well, to make a 2-week story short, we had a Thanksgiving break, and the first meeting after the Thanksgiving break, I gave them a pop quiz. And I said, here's a blank map of Africa. You divide it into somewhere between 3 and 6 regions and write a phrase to tell me what is in that region. So there's 6 of their typical answers. You can't possibly read it from here. So what I did was I scanned their answer and recolored it using the colors of my original map. Now, you have that original map in your short-term memory for at least another 20 minutes, unless it's late in the afternoon, in which case it's already gone, so I brought it back here. That's what the original map looked like. And what I thought was interesting was that the desert became farming on every one of those kids' maps. And the rainforest disappeared from where it is on every one of the maps. It moved on 4 of them and disappeared completely. Africa has no more rainforest on that one. That's the fact that we need to walk away with. It doesn't matter if it's a map of the ecoregions of Africa or the travels of Ibn Battuta or the invasion of Napoleon. Kids cannot store that map image. There is no such thing as a visual learner. And these students didn't learn how to study maps when they were in school. And if this is your mental map of Africa, you can't possibly understand malaria or Islam or colonization or the slave trade or Boko Haram today or Somali pirates. You can't just say, study this map, especially when you're looking at typical maps in history textbooks, where we're supposed to learn the Roman Empire from, or that one, which is a more recent map of the Roman Empire in a public domain textbook, or a map of the languages of Europe. In other words, kids, you can tell them to study it, but it is going to be gone. Or if it's an American history class, how about the spread westward? You can't just say study the map. You've got to know how to ask questions, or you have to model the inquiry, or both. And what we try to do in Giants is to provide the questions and to give examples of modeling that inquiry. In other words, to use that map for 20 seconds, not taking away your existing lesson, just supplementing it with a map lesson that does the job. So with that, you could turn your camera on if you want to be part of this game. We're going to take a look at Sandy's grinning over there. I can tell she turned her camera on like this. To understand how children see a map, you have to understand how human brains encode this spatial information. And the spoiler alert, of course, is we do it in a number of different ways. So I have a map of a room for you to memorize. It's got 9 tables on it. They're in a perfect square. The tables are all perfect squares, and they all have a book on them, and the book is identical. So it's about as simple a room as you can come up with. It's not a very complicated map. The door to the room is over here, and I hid a $50 bill underneath that book. And the question is, this is you. You're standing right there in front of the room. So the question is, how are you going to remember where that treasure is? And if we were sitting in a room here, I would go and have a couple people respond, but the chat works a little bit too slowly. So I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to say, you might be thinking this is near my right hand. And if so, hold your right hand up in front like this. You might be thinking it's on the orange table. You think the book's on the orange table, hold your hand up. If you think that you're going to remember because it's in the middle of the front row of tables, hold your hand up. How about the book that's in the front middle of its table? Okay, got another couple votes there. How about on the door side of the room? Anybody have another clue? I don't believe Sean or Dave are going to qualify for this one here. Now, the spoiler alert, which I warned you about earlier, is that your brain is actually processing 7 different ways of remembering. I have never, in doing this for about 800 teachers over 5 years, I've never had anybody come up with a 7th one. I've only had a handful of people with a 6th one. But your brain thinks of about 7 different ways automatically, all at once in parallel. But, and this is a big but, unless you actually try, you're not likely to be aware of more than 1 or 2 of them at a time. And you're an educated adult, so you might be able to think of 4 or 5, but a young child is almost sure to think of only 1. So I'm leading you off into another room. Over the course of doing this with about 800 teachers, they have generally voted for those 6 places. So if you want one of the other 3, you're welcome to have the other 3. You just have to be able to tell me where it is. How many of you would vote for number 1? And how many would vote for place number 2? How about number 3? Number 4? 5? And 6? So the treasure is in the same place that it was. And I just saw a 5 up there. And the question is very simple. What table has it? The answer is definitely not simple. It depends on what mode you're processing it through, where these networks are. If you said it's near your right hand, which is, by the way, where about half of 2nd graders and almost 3/4 of 1st graders will put it, because they have an egocentric view of the world, and that happens to be the closest thing, and it's just to my right hand there. You would have said table number 1. Adults don't tend to think of that one. If, however, you said the orange table, table number 2, that's a color association. And by the way, that proximity network is on the back right-hand side of your head. The association network's in front of your right ear. The sequence network, it's in the middle of the front row of tables. That's above your left eyebrow, inside your brain, I mean. The analogy, it's in the book that's in the front middle of its table, number 4. That's right up at the top of your head, and it's an analogical form of reasoning. If you said it's the middle of the table or the door side of the room, that actually requires both sequencing and orientation, which means it involves 2 brain networks. And the $50 bill is actually hiding underneath table number 6. And the reason it's hiding underneath table number 6 is that in the first room, it was in the bottom middle of the desk that's in the bottom middle of the room, and now it's in the upper right-hand corner of the desk that's in the upper right-hand corner of the room. And the fact that only 1 person voted for this one in this crowd here is very typical. It, however, is a caution. This is one of the reasons that multiple choice high-stakes tests are so dangerous, is that very often a handful of kids in the room will think of a right answer that never occurred to the test designer. And yet it is a completely right answer. And so we need to figure out within Giants a way to allow students to make a hypothetical guess like that we didn't think of. The bottom line is that human brains have multiple networks. They work in parallel, they work at the same time, and they are not conscious. The same kind of thing is happening with reading. I am rereading a great book called Reading in the Brain because we've got a big multi-state session on K2 geography. And I'm more and more impressed by how much even reading involves the sequestering of multiple brain networks in a precise sequence, that there's at least 4 different kinds of dyslexia. And when you get a kid showing up in 7th grade and still having problems reading, we might be able to give you some things to watch for as they're looking at a map because they're using the same brain networks. So here's a key article if you actually want to follow this up a little bit. Note when it was published in 2004. And it basically says different brain areas are involved when you judge locations. I've counted to several hundred articles since then, and they all tend to have the same kinds of words in it: 2 forms, separate channels, parallel processing, multiple systems, and the magic buzzword for educators, individual differences. And then I'll close this one out with a little bit of a joke. If human brains were simple enough for us to understand them, we'd be so simple we couldn't. Oh, by the way, none of this is about learning styles. That is another piece of 20th century nonsense that's going to require a whole different presentation on a whole different night sometime. I'd be happy to do it, but no time right now. Human brains have multiple networks to process spatial information. They operate in parallel and not always consciously. It helps us understand multiple kinds of dyslexia. And to see why this matters in the classroom, I want to take a look at one simple map for 1st graders, and then a couple maps for high school students, and work my way up like that. So let's take a look at symbol maps. If you happen to recognize one in here, you could make a note in the chat room, and we could ask about specific kinds of maps if there's a question answer period later on. I'll have this little bit of a summary thing here because when this thing gets posted up, it's going to get posted up as a handful of separate PowerPoints. Some people might have missed the earlier one. But notions about close to, inside, between, together, and in the same position, all of these notions are done with different brain networks. And why this is important, Millet turned out to have been terribly important for early African history. And as a result, a lot of these early kids' maps have got a little grain symbol in there somewhere. And there are a lot of these. I mean, I'm picking on one particular one as my example, but I've got a collection of about 40 of them. I would like to ask you a question though, that if a kid could actually learn from a map like this and saw this map that I'm pointing at, did you see my pointer flashing around? You know, the map in the upper right corner, if they had that in 1st grade and could actually learn from it, would they have screwed up my map when they got to my class? I'm not going to say don't use a map like this, because with a great teacher, anything can be a learning aid. But the teacher has got to know how to use this kind of map. So let me go back to that Millet symbol, because the evidence is clear. Children don't learn much geography from it. So there's the grain symbol. How might a child encode where that is? You know, how's the kid going to remember where it is? And some of them are going to say, well, it's near the gorilla. That, by the way, is table 1, right? The proximity network. Some are going to say it's in the light green color. That's table 2, the orange table. Some are going to say that's between the camel and the oil well. That's table number 3, the middle of the front row. Some of them would say it's in northern Nigeria. That's table number 4, the analogic position network. In other words, they're going to remember the location of that symbol using exactly the same brain networks that you used with that simple game a minute ago. So with that in mind, that some of them will have this elaborate combination. They will know that Gola is a parallel kind of community in there. They're using the same brain networks that you used. Now, let's take a look at how this matters for a classroom and for curriculum design. The little boilerplate at the beginning, all of these things, shape, direction, position, orientation, close to, inside, between, in this order, associated, all of these are done with different brain networks. That statement is based on what is now more than 5,400 research reports since 1995. In other words, 5,400 more recent research reports than the Common Core. How does this work in a classroom? I'm going to go to 2nd grade for just a couple minutes here, because I want people in 2nd grade to do something that are going to help you teach history in 7th grade. And then we're going to show why and what you can do about it if they didn't do that. So read them a story about camels if you're in 2nd grade, not about penguins or cockroaches or dinosaurs. Camels are just as cool as penguins are. I mean, they chew sideways, they spit on you if you don't like you. They sound like Chewbacca because, in fact, Chewbacca's soundtrack is a camel recording. Camels are cool, but a camel map is worth learning. So read a story about camels with your students and then encourage them to do 10 seconds worth of spatial thinking. In other words, don't just point to the camel on a complicated map like this and say, here's where they are, because they will not remember that. What you do is you give them an extremely simple map, a map that just shows where camels live in Africa. And then you say, why don't you draw a line around where the camels live? And if they do that in 2nd grade, and then they do it with pine trees and Ojibwe settlements in 4th, 3rd grade, and they do it with something else in 5th grade, indigo plantations, then maybe by the time they get to 7th grade, they're going to be doing this automatically. But if not, you're going to have to do it a couple times and show them how to do it. So have them draw the line around there and tell them to color the camel region. Now, in 2nd grade, we recommend that the teachers read something like the following to say, hey, kids, you just made a regional map of camels in Africa. Now, we need to warn you, Africa is really big and it's really far away. It's a whole lot bigger than Muskegon or Macomb County. But you kids are smart. You can say something about Africa just by looking at this map. And again, if we were all sitting in a room, I would ask you to come up with some questions, because what question do you ask? And the question that you ask is going to be different in 2nd grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and 7th grade. In 6th grade, you want to ask why the camels live in that place. But in 2nd grade, you want to just make sure they understand which end of Africa is north. Which of course means you have to have done something else about north, like name the walls of your classroom and have them point to north and do the Simon Says games and things like that. But do camels like to live in the north part of Africa or the south? Now, the reason we do that in Giants, and why you need to know about this as a 7th grade teacher in Giants, is that you can't count on people having done Giants in the earlier grades. You will have to do some things that we're assuming that they've done, because these spatial associations are cumulative. If a 1st or 2nd grader draws a line around where the camels live, it is a whole lot easier to learn a map of deserts in 7th grade, because it's basically the same map. And once they've learned the map of camels and deserts, then they've got your 8th grade, your 7th grade, where is Islam? solved because Islam was spread by Muhammad, whose uncle was a camel trader, and therefore he was plugged into these camel trading networks. And camels spread Islam just about as far as a camel would be willing to walk into the forest for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's hard for a camel to walk in a forest. And number two, the forest was full of malaria mosquitoes, and camels are actually susceptible to a bunch of tropical diseases like that occur within the rainforest. Now, that's going to come back when we talk about slavery. It's going to come back when we talk about colonization. In other words, we're building something here that they're going to use in 8th grade when they talk about the Civil War and the roots of the indigo plantations and why rice is a part of the diet in Louisiana and coastal South Carolina and places like that. So the neurological bottom line is that different kids encode information from a map in different ways. You need to guide them to do it the same way if you want them to remember that way. In other words, you need to know some of the words that will trigger a particular brain network. That's not going to be obvious in Giants. We're going to hide that underneath the hood. But different kids do different kinds of spatial thinking with different degrees of skill. And with proper guidance, every kid can learn how to do it all better. We're hoping that they did some of that in earlier grades. But if not, some of the early lessons in units 1, 2, and 3 of Giants 7th grade actually go over some of these old ideas that were in the earlier grades. So, Common Core to the contrary, kids don't just get information from a map. They have to learn how to learn from maps. And they should do that with maps that matter. So tell your 2nd grade teacher to read a story about camels, not penguins, because it's going to help you in 7th grade. Now, I have a direct link over to clickable maps, but Davey put his screen back on, which is his subtle way of saying, where are we in time? And I don't have a clue.
We're doing okay on. No, we're doing
still
okay.
Early.
We're doing okay on time so far. And I just wanted to make sure that we gave everyone an opportunity to ask any questions that they might have before we moved into the next piece. Because tonight is really about giving you guys the keys to the car, where this stuff is hidden under the hood, to use the analogy or the metaphor that Phil used, just a few minutes ago. And I can tell you that we did a catalog last year of all of the Phil activities that we've added to 7th grade Giants this year. And there's well over 100 of them, and you'll start to be able to recognize them as you go through the units. You'll know exactly which ones came from Dave Johnston because they're Spartan and utilitarian and just, not pretty at all, but they get the job done. And then you'll have these wonderful pieces that Phil put together that bring all of this brain science that he just spent the last 20 minutes talking about right to the forefront in your own classroom. So before we get into this next piece of it, does anyone have any questions they might want to ask Phil? All right, I did my 3-breath virtual learning pause and I saw no screens change. So I'm going to mute and turn it back to Phil. And Phil, thank you for letting me put the plug in for questions just in case there were any there.
To provide some kind of an example and at the same time show how this is built under the hood, I wanted to wander out to a website that I'm going to hope showed up on the screen there. Did it? Or do I have to reshare here?
Nope, you're good, Phil. We can see it.
You can see it. So this is the current version of the Clickable Maps website. And you might notice that there's a column marked World Geography and History. And it's got a couple of the ones that we're going to be using even today. We're going to look at the geohistogram, and we're going to look a little bit about ancient cities and show a little bit about old world trade. This is a Spartan list. There's actually considerably more of these that will appear in that right-hand column of Giants, because we're going to wait until we get enough to fill a screen like this, and then we're going to create a whole new website that's clickable maps for world history. So you need to keep wandering back over the course of the year, because part of it is in order to get feedback from you. Dave was talking about lessons that, quote, I created. And I have to be honest with you that I spent a good part of this morning corresponding with a fifth grade teacher, going back and forth as she was designing the lesson that we're going to do, and I'm just providing a map. And then I emailed back and forth with third grade teachers who were writing a lesson that I'm simply going to provide a map of Michigan tailored to their specifications. So a lot of these lessons are being created by teachers. And that is not an completely pro bono process, is what I'm going to say. Is that I've got access to a little bit of grant money, and if you've got a gap within the curriculum where you think, you know, there really ought to be a lesson about such and so right about here, the right time to call me about that is about 3 weeks earlier, and we'll see if we can't build one by then, and I will pay you for your time. I've only cut checks to about 35 teachers in 2021 so far, in 3 different states. Because what makes these lessons work is when the teacher comes up with the hook that makes that memorable for that fit. I need to say that when we're looking at clickable maps like this, because the world geography and history column in here is not the only one you want to look at. That every one of these world regional clickables has got at least 5 layers that were created specifically to support activities within a world history class. So to give you just one very simple example, but I'm stealing from a little further ahead of time, from basically lesson 3 and lesson 6 over here, is that the Europe one talks about the variety of Europe. And so it names some of the peninsulas of Europe, and it's got a little list of what they are here. Because unlike every other place in the world, Europe is a place of peninsulas. And peninsulas are a great thing if your enemy only has slow ships and no airplanes. Because a peninsula is like a room with just one door. You've only got to defend against one, you know, you could hide behind the desk and face the door and wait for them to come in and shoot them. So Europe wound up with a completely different political geography than China or India or Africa, because Europe had lots of places that people could hide. Whereas in China, if you had one warlord that got a little bit stronger, they could pretty much cover most of China there. So you might find it useful to talk about the European peninsulas about the time you start talking about Greece or Italy, or something like that. It's also got a map of the Roman Empire, but more to that point, it talks a little bit about colonies. It's got a map of where the Greek colonies were and where the Roman colonies were. Now, if you take that map of Roman colonies and you say, why would they pick those particular things? You might actually find it useful to take a look at where the metal deposits were, because the Romans were pretty good mining engineers. They knew that there was tin available up here in Cornwall. They knew that there was other alloys. They knew that there was copper down here in the Rio Tinto Valley. In other words, you can take a look at these clickable maps for these other places. Look at the Roman Empire or the Roman colonies, and you can kind of see that the Romans weren't exactly stupid in where they decided to invade, what they wanted to defend. So it wasn't just after territory, it was after resources. Note that there's a clear map button. Note, by the way, that all of these clickable maps are based on a CIA map, which means that the map automatically is identical to a whole raft of maps that you would find from the US government, from the CIA and the Geologic Survey and the Department of Interior and so on. So we deliberately made all the clickable maps to match up with the CIA map in order to accomplish that. It also has got some ways to put color on it so that you can make the map a little bit brighter in order to put it up on screen. And then you click off, and grab a little screenshot of just the map and put it into your PowerPoint. So you probably want to pay attention. When you're using these clickable maps, you should know that the button for the clickable maps, the button for the menu always stays live. So you can put multiple clickable maps up and compare them with each other. And with that, I'm going to wander over to Africa for a few minutes here, because there's a little game that you can play real early in 7th grade. Say, there's the ancient empires of Africa. And Africa had a whole bunch of them. Now, for the moment, let's just ignore Egypt and Carthage, because those were water-based empires, one based on a river and one based on the Mediterranean Sea. And take a look at these over here. Tell me, how would you describe the pattern? And how would you remember where it is? And by the way, why is it like that? I mean, they're obviously not scattered all over the place. So you can ask your students for a hypothesis as to why those are where they are. Their answers are going to reveal a lot about their mental map of Africa already. Now it's not fair to give you that, because some of you still have my original mental map of Africa in your mental short-term memory. And so you know that the one you probably want to click on over here is about the ecoregions. And there's a region that we had those ecoregions there. You might actually find it useful to put the camels there, because every single one of those empire capitals is right at the southern edge of the camel region. And the camel region is there because that's where the trade routes were. That those cities were nodes in a trading network that was based on camels and donkeys. So you can put the camel map up. I better just clear the map over here and go back to the camel map. You can put the camel map up and have the kids do, say, draw a line around the camel region, because it's going to help you understand where the desert is. And once you know where the desert is, you understand a whole lot about Africa. Where's there malaria, where's these other things. I do want to call your attention to one more thing about every clickable map. They all have something about the United States on them. And there's a good reason for that. Dave and I were at a meeting in Texas a couple of years ago, and we pointed out to the Texans something that they already knew. In fact, they were pointing it out to us. Texas is a really big state. In fact, it's a state that's got 5 different cultures in it. There's the Piney Woods, which is all white and Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. And then there's Tex-Mex, that's Hispanic and down in the South. And the High Plains is kind of, sagebrush country. And the hill country. And then there's the petrochemical Gulf Coast. Some people even pull out the Metroplex, Dallas and so on. They say, Texas has got 5 cultures in it. So I thought, why don't we just put Texas on here? So there is Texas at the right size and the right latitude for a map of Africa. And I've got a question for you guys. It's the first of a couple questions that we might ask like this. If Texas has 5 different cultures in it, why do the Michigan Glicks talk about the culture of Africa? And in fact, they mention it in 2 different grades, that students should summarize the culture of Africa. And I would suggest that Africa has got at least a dozen cultures in it. And a lot of those cultures are tied to what the ecoregion is. You're going to have a pastoral culture up here. And there's going to be a layer hiding around here somewhere about pastoralism. I knew that was likely to elude me somewhere. Oh, we got the old version up here. new version has got pastoralism on it because the teacher had suggested we ought to have a layer on that added.
So I'm the guy who puts these together for Phil online so that you can access them. And every so often I get batch emails filled with Adobe Illustrator files of new layers and things to put on. So
Yeah.
apologies that one's not up right now, Phil. I guess I missed that.
It could be that I was holding it because we got a couple more things that need to be fixed on this one. Like there's one thing that goes on and doesn't come back off again. Now it does go all the way up to fairly modern times, you know, the old colonial things like that. And for 6th grade, there's a little gimmick up here in the corner, which you may actually find fun in 7th grade too, because we know that 6th and 7th graders, middle school kids in general, are closet pyromaniacs. So you show them where all the fires burn and you ask, you know, why is it burning like that in those particular places? And they try to figure out, you know, what's the relationship with the amount of rain that you get in January as opposed to the amount of rain that you get in July. There's nothing better for making fire than to have a lot of rain in one season so you get a lot of plant growth and then have it get really dry for the other 9 months of the year and let it dry out a whole lot. So like I say, this particular clickable map is designed to support inquiries in 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and 7th grade. And I don't know how we're doing on time, Dave. We can wander back over to that, or we could look at Earth environments for a second.
We're still good on time, but I know a couple of people have questions, so I'll let them unmute and ask you first.
Okay.
Phil, this is Sean. I had a question about printing maps directly from the clickable site, and maybe Dave can weigh into. I've kind of just worked around by taking screenshots of specific layers that I wanted to either put into a PowerPoint or to print for students, let's say. Is there a better way to print directly from that site? Or how do you suggest doing that? Because like, for example, the map of the camels, you had mentioned having students, you know, work and draw a line around them. Are you, you know, can you print right from that camel layer on the clickables, or do you have to save it in some other way?
Screenshot's going to be your best bet. And then you can either dump it into a Word document or make a PDF out of the screenshot that you take, but that screenshot will be your best bet.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thanks, Dave.
And one other thought, that especially if we're at an ISD like that, we probably have other monitors floating around. I do my screenshots on a second monitor that has 2500 dot resolution, because then I can enlarge it on that second monitor as big as I can make it, then take my screenshot off of that. But that's the way I do it, that I do them all from the screenshot. Or if I really want high quality, I go back to the original Adobe file. And if you want that for an activity, I'd be happy to provide that as a PDF, you know.
No, it's not needing a specific one. I just like, even with the PDF files of the clickables, are you able to print a specific layer that you have on the screen? Is that how can you do it right from the PDF that way?
I'd like to say yes, but the fact is some of them aren't that well organized. Dave will attest to the fact that we go back and forth every once in a while. The layers don't make sense. Because when you're doing a PDF, you know, a typical clickable map like this will have 40 to 50 layers and only 25 of them are on screen, but we need the other ones in order to have things look right. We've got masks and we've got, you know, cutout areas and things like that. The PDFs tend to be a little messy that way.
If you think of them like old transparencies for the old overhead projectors we used to have, each layer is a transparency that you're putting over top of the other one. So it makes it a little hard. And we've had more conversations about changing the online version than the PDF, simply because this is the, you know, Chromebook people can't access the clickable PDFs. And this was the workaround that just ended up working better for everyone else.
No, and screenshots work. Phil brought up the only problem with screenshots was the resolution when you blow it up to, you know, print it larger sometimes, but it's that works for now. Thank you for answering that.
Yeah, if you can put it on the biggest monitor you can find somewhere. You know, we even Carol even carries them down to our television, which is it uses that as an external monitor and then grabs her screenshots from that. So we will have a session on the geohistogram after a break a little bit later on. I've got some sample activities that are there. I would like to call your attention to another website that Dave and I just put together this summer. It is aimed primarily at sixth grade world geography, but it is a complete website specifically about Earth environments. And so it's got the polar environments, it's got the equatorial rainforest environment, the desert environment. There's a presentation, there's a chapter, there's a video, and there are a handful of activities that are connected to these different world environments. And particularly for those of you that are teaching in several grade levels in middle school, you know, you're the geography history teacher and you're bouncing back and forth between 6th and 7th or 7th and 8th or something like that. You might want to know about this, but even those that are locked in 7th grade, you may get a question about environments from the students that you're not sure you got an answer for. You could send them to this website. And it is a kind of a crash course in what are the advantages and limitations of different Earth environments. So a typical video for this one, you know, we've been looking at deserts and camels for a while over here. We'll have a climograph about what the desert looks like. And it'll have a map of the dry months, a map of temperature, a map of where solar collectors can be particularly efficient. Things like that. What are the problems with the kind of soil that occurs? And for each one of these map layers, there's a text that will explain what's going on right on screen there. So you don't necessarily have to jump over to the presentations, which aren't hot linked right here yet because we're still working on that part of it. But in any case, I'm calling your attention to another website. We're hoping eventually that the world history one is going to look something like this, where it's going to have links to a video that explains it. And this has a complete set of videos that actually explain what's going on in that environment. Now, the videos use layers from the clickable map. I don't know, Dave, you got anything else you wanted to say about how these got made? I mean, most of this was in your hands.
Just that it was a labor of love over the summer. And Phil is really lucky that I think of him as a friend, a colleague, a mentor, and a father figure, because there were days I wanted to walk away from this, but it looks beautiful, and it's got a lot of really good information that we'll probably be linking to in the 7th grade Giants in some places as well.
So with that, I'm going to call my section closed because we may need an extra 5 minutes for the way late afternoon one. There may be more questions out of that one because it actually has more sample activities in it.
Well, and what's a first for us, we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, which is amazing. I think we've both grown as people over the years, Phil. And so the piece that we have right before break is Becky wanted to weigh in with some, oh, that's a really cool animation. You've got an origami thing going there.
Well, that was to tell me that I was at the end of that PowerPoint there.
Becky wanted to weigh in with a brief summation that kind of puts all of this together. So I'm going to turn things over to her to kind of bring that through. And then we'll be taking a quick break, and then we'll get into the Unit 1 overview, which is back to me. So. You are muted, Becky, but you look fantastic.
Yeah, you're hilarious, Dave Johnson. I was going to do the summation through an interpretive dance, but I sprained my ankle earlier this afternoon. So no summation, no interpretive dance.
Gotcha. Well, in that case, we are going to take our break right now, and Becky will ice her leg. Phil will grab a cup of hot tea, and we will all be back here in 15 minutes time, which, according to my watch, will put us at 5:45, which is still about 15 minutes ahead of schedule. So 5:45, we'll come back together and we'll start digging into the actual units. Have a great break, guys. All right, so let me get back into the swing of things here for you. We set up tonight's agenda in a way that gave Phil a bunch of time at the beginning to kind of talk about the brain science behind things. And now we're going to kind of switch gears and move into the Giants units overall, and your 6 weeks of instruction, essentially. So we've got units 1 and 2 on deck tonight for our overview, and that's because they're both super short units. And we'll be back together in just under 4 weeks to come back together towards the end of October to go through Unit 3. Some of you started school and may have started teaching these units already. So this will give you an idea of what to maybe go back and spend some more time on, or what, what's coming next if you haven't officially launched into and started the units yet. And so again, I wanted to remind you that on the pacing view, which is one way you can pull up these units now, always look at what unit you're in and the rough number of weeks. We take everything as a 36-week school year, and that includes factoring out breaks, Christmas break, Thanksgiving, etc. So these are really designed for a 36-week school year to go in depth. You can see that with 7th grade in particular, we've got a really long unit for Unit 6, and that's where we get into the fall of civilizations and things like that. But we kick right off with a unit that's all on the historical thinking skills, and particularly the H standards in our standards document for 7th grade. So if I pull open lesson 1 here, you can see right off the bat, we actually link right out to the updated Michigan content standards. And that's a step 0 on this lesson sequence. And that is there just for you. And if you don't know about this site yet, I'm going to recommend that you bookmark it, but it'll take you directly to the standards document. But if you just shorten the URL to misocialstudies.org, Roy and Rebecca and Phil and I and many others were all part of the revisions to Michigan's content expectations. And one thing was abundantly clear to all of us when we were finishing the process and trying to figure out where to put them. And that thing that was abundantly clear to all of us was that these can't just live on the Michigan Department of Education website, because no one has ever found anything useful on the Department of Education website. Now, don't mishear me, there's tons of useful information on the Department of Education's website. The problem is nobody can ever find it. So www.misocialstudies.org was born out of that group, and it's your one-stop shop for everything social studies related in the state of Michigan. And you can see we have a section for the standards where you can pull up a whole grade band, because many of you teach different grade levels, or you can pull up your individual grade level. You can even pull up in the full document. We also link you out to the C3 framework. And if you're curious about things that changed, because we were midway through, social studies was poised to have its day in the spotlight when the pandemic hit, and now everyone's back to, it's like we went back in time 5 years. Now all anyone's talking about is literacy again. They were just ready to start to have those conversations about social studies, and poof. So thank you, COVID-19. So just know you can pull up your standards here as well. And as for a couple of other things I wanted you to be aware of, we have a lot of the ISDs and content organizations have stuff that's open to everyone. And we have this professional learning calendar where you can get registered for virtual events. You can see we've got Giants up here, and we've got some stuff that Michigan Council for History Ed is doing. Michigan Council for Economic Ed has stuff on this calendar as well. All of the content organizations, email me regularly so I can update this calendar. So just know that that stuff is there as well. And if you ever forget how to get to Giants, but you know this website, you can click on resources, and we built recently a resource showcase. And Giants is one of the many resources that we showcase there. And the button is not working right now because it's a new page. So I'll add that to my to-do list. But the button will normally work, and it will take you to the Giants website, which is fantastic. And I will make sure that that is working. So, all right, back to the lesson at hand. I closed all of my windows. I'm going to go back to Unit 1 and Lesson 1. So we include the standards there for you because they did change, and many of you may not have had a chance to really soak in what changed and what's new there. So that's there. And with these rollouts, about 60 to 65% of each rollout is going to be fill, because a lot of the fill stuff is not as self-explanatory as some of the other things. But that doesn't mean that the Dave stuff is all perfectly clear, or clear as, in some cases, it means it's clear as mud. So, you know, in a normal session, I'll be doing a little bit to demonstrate some of the pieces that I wrote that I don't think are quite as self-explanatory. And one of those is garbage bag archaeology. Now, if you're a teacher of mine who has been in my PD before that I deliver in person, we've done garbage bag archaeology. This is just where you take your desk, whatever's on your desk at home, and you just throw all of it into a garbage bag and you bring it into school. And you create little stations around your classroom that has some of this information. And you tell the kids, hey, you know what? We are, we're digging up the relics of this house from 100 years ago, and we're trying to get a better picture of what people in this time period that we have no historical records for whatsoever. You know, that's with a slight wink, but we're trying to piece together how these people lived, what their lives were like, and the only way we can do that is they didn't throw their garbage away. So we're going to dig through their garbage, and it lets the kids kind of go through, and they work in groups to kind of develop a picture of who these people were by traveling from station to station in these small groups. And every group will have some very similar things that they'll take from this. Whenever I do this, I always end up with some bills in there. I end up with some coupons. They're like, oh, this person is thrifty. As you go through, their vision of who this person or these people were is going to change as they get more information, and where they start may lead them in a different direction than their other history or their other historian friends in other groups. So garbage bag archaeology takes about a whole class period. And so I tried to really outline the steps for it here. It's definitely one that I would circle back to if you haven't done this already with your kids, if you haven't pulled these units up, because not only is it a great way to kind of explain how historians come to the conclusions that they come to, it's also a really good getting to know you activity for the start of the year. As you're building those classroom relationships and you're starting to form your classroom culture for the year. So garbage bag archaeology is there. I know Kathy's on and Joe's on, and they've both experienced this before. It looks like Kathy's nodding. So, definitely give it a try. We've put it here in 7th grade. It's not in any of the other grade levels. And it's one of my favorites. I wish I could steal it and say that it was mine, but you can't spell teachers without the same letters as the word cheaters. They're all there. And I stole this from my good friend Laurel Schmidt, who wrote the book Social Studies That Sticks. And I absolutely love this. Now, I have expanded upon it since then, but she's given it her full blessing and said we can include it in the Giants unit. So going through lesson 1 and lesson 2 and lesson 3 of unit 1, you're going to find a lot of things that start to introduce your kids to how to study history and how to study the past. And from Phil's perspective, how to also study geography through these same lenses. So unit 1, that's my brief overview of unit 1. We really, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, but we really designed it to be about 7 to 10 days of instruction. The original unit, and that's the difference with this rollout from all of our others. Phil and I took the original Giant 7th grade author's work and scaled it up. And they had a really long historical thinking skills unit, but we shortened it because we're going to build on these skills through the units themselves. So let's not beat a dead horse. Let's, do some really good intro to studying history pieces, and then let's jump into the history and practice these skills throughout. So that's my bird's eye view of Unit 1. I'm going to give you a similar one for Unit 2 in a few minutes, but again, notice this blob is very small. It's about 7 to 10 days of instruction. And from here, I'm going to turn it over to Phil to talk about one of the things we introduced in Unit 1, which is the world. I almost said the US. We have a US geohistogram as well, but the world geohistogram. So with that, Phil, I've stopped sharing my screen and I'm going to mute and I'm going to turn it over to you.
So I push the green button and try to get to screen number 2.
It's working. You're good.
So I'm going to do a quick introduction of what the geohistogram is about as a diagram, and then one of the activities that we recommend fairly early on. Now, this is more a discussion activity than a geohistogram activity, but it uses a geohistogram as a framework. There are other frameworks that it could use, and we could talk about that. And then we're going to go back to the clickable maps, because you notice up at the top of the clickable maps under World Geography and History, it says geohistogram, and show how you can use the clickable version of that. So with that, punching that button ought to put that up. The geohistogram is just a tool to fit how the human brain actually organizes certain kinds of knowledge in a space-time context. It's a fact that a very well-written story or a video or a film about the Mongols can be quite memorable. We found that out in New York because weeks later, they were able to describe what it felt like to be a farmer when the Mongols came over the hill. And then we asked them a really loaded question. What continent were the Mongols on? And less than half of the students knew. And we asked them, were they about the same time as Moses, Muhammad, Mansa Musa, or Martin Luther King? And no lie, 25% of our students actually thought the Mongols were at the same time as Martin Luther King history. In other words, we have to figure out a way to help the students remember when and where these things occurred. That was the genesis of the geohistogram. This is the basic geohistogram. It's 7 wiggly vertical bars. It's 7 for a reason, and the reason is the same as why phone numbers are 7 digits long and a number of other things. It has to do with the number of slots of your visual short-term memory. Time goes from the past at the bottom to the present up at the top. That is different from most timelines, but the research very clearly shows that a timeline that goes from left to right on the wall, about 25 to 30% of the students are not able to process that as time, because the timeline in your brain actually goes from the bottom to the top. It goes like the rock layers in geology, or like the artifacts in archaeology, or like the papers on Dave's desk that he wants to clean up for the garbage can every once in a while. On the geohistogram, space goes from west on the left to east on the right. The 7 bars represent the 7 major world regions. There's a geek note. I'm going to have 3 of these here. The geek note says this layout, both the time and the space arrangement of this layout, is based on research in cognitive neuroscience, and particularly eye tracking studies. You probably don't have time to read a whole bunch of these things, but we did in order to plan the design. And we'll leave it about at that. There is a separate PowerPoint, which is accessible through the website, that explains why the regions were divided the way they are. But the borders are deliberately fuzzy. And in fact, I've got a kind of a smart-ass remark here. If a student asks me, is Afghanistan really a part of South Asia or Central Asia, or is it a part of the middle like this? The first thing that I do is congratulate them on having a clue where Afghanistan is in the world. Because the truth of the matter is, that's progress. That's a lot of progress. And the second truth of the matter is, for part of its history, Afghanistan was indeed part of Central Asia. And for part of its history, it was part of South Asia. And for part of its history, it was part of Persia. And even the Greeks had a hold over it for about 15 or 20 years. So Afghanistan is an unusual place. They have been learning how to get rid of foreign invaders for about 2,700 years. On the geohistogram, each big wiggle is about 2,000 years. That time scale is designed to match what the research says about how the brain processes space, time, quantity. This is a bigger problem in 3rd and 4th grade than it is by 7th grade, because by 7th grade, people have figured out that there's a difference between linear and logarithmic arithmetic. But in the human brain, the timeline is logarithmic. And that makes 1st and 2nd grade very hard to teach, because we tell them that the numbers are equally spaced, and in your brain, they're not. And the kids think that that's one of the first things that teachers tell us that are idiot things we have to memorize, but we really don't believe it. It's a cognitive problem in 1st and 2nd grade. That's the basic framework. Now we can add anything to this. So Caesar Augustus was the emperor of Rome at the beginning of the Common Era. He's pointing at exactly where it is. And you can put it down there and say, this is Caesar Augustus. Or gunpowder was invented in China about the year 850. That's about right there. Here's a really simple use of the geohistogram. You can make a colored blob on it to show the extent of the Mesopotamian Empire. Yeah, the Mesopotamia kind of started up about 4,000 something BC, and it started to build cities and then expand a little bit. Hammurabi came around, and a little bit later on, Mesopotamia ceased to be of any significance in world history because places like Persia and Rome got a little bit bigger and tougher. The kids can write the empire names in chronological order. If they do that just once, I guarantee that it works better than reading it 6 times in a list in a book, because they put it in the order in which the brain actually processes time information, with the oldest at the bottom. Varying the width of an empire blob can show how big it was. So putting several features at the same time. So now I've added the empires of Egypt and the Indus Valley to it. And this is where it gets really cool, because your brain and your visual system have automatically encoded these relationships. They now know that Mesopotamia is in the middle between Egypt and the Indus Valley, and that Indus Valley is off to the east. It didn't last as long. Egypt lasted a much longer time, and in fact, in some form has persisted all the way up to the present day. Whereas the Indus Valley is a separate civilization, died out earlier. All of that is kind of encoded in a brain network that can be accessed later on. You just have to know how to have them describe it when they do that. So you ask them questions about it. Let's write the New Kingdom. And the New Kingdom was a kingdom of some power because it occurred between when Babylon and Assyria were tremendously important. So you can take the names off the geohistogram at any time and make a quiz out of it. So there, Sean's going to clip that out, and make a test out of it. And having them write about the relationships between these ancient empires can be a Common Core writing activity. It's about summarization and generalization, comparing and contrasting, so on. Okay, so far. So a more complex shape shows what Greece was like. Scattered villages for a long time. That's what the dotted lines are. There's archaeological evidence of people being there without an organized government. And then a very small early democracy that spread out around a chunk of the Mediterranean and going over even into North Africa in the middle here. And then a great big leap out to the east for Alexander the Great, as in what's purple, and invaded all the way to Central Asia. What did Alex actually do was led an army around an existing empire where the Persian rulers had already done all the hard work, building roads and cities and bridges and common laws and the coin system and, you know, centuries of work, which is partly why Alexander's empire didn't last very long, because he basically claimed it without the ability to rule it, and just didn't have enough Greeks to spread out all over there. A geographer takes a look at this, though, and notices something, and that is that they both stopped at exactly the same place because they both ran into a barrier, the powerful groups that became the Mauryan Empire in South Asia. Students very rarely see that connection because our textbooks tend to talk about the West and then the East kind of separately. And we really don't make that link. So that's one of the things the geohistogram lets you do, is when you're talking about the West, you can mention something that's happening out East about the same time. Because in fact, that's what geohistogram does. It tells you what else was happening at the same time. That when you had the Roman and the Han empires pushing toward each other, the Silk Road becomes a logical connection between them. Second thing is it tells you how things might have changed in one place over a long period of time. And in the case of China, that's been a single political entity that kept changing who was in charge. But basically, they defined themselves as Chinese all the way back from the Qin Empire here. The third thing the geohistogram can do is it can support some inquiry activities. I'll give you one example, and then we'll go through an example a little bit later on that you use right away. This is a very simple example. It shows up basically in eras 3 and 4. But it's a pretty dramatic one. For as an example, the Hittites lived in Anatolia about 1400 BC. They were among the very first people to make iron tools. We'll talk about that a little bit later on when we crank the Hittite history back 2,000 years and find out that they didn't live there, they lived in Central Asia. But that's one of the stories way later this afternoon, right? Here's a historic generalization that probably works. Whenever people who had only wooden tools were attacked by an army with iron weapons, they lost. All the way up to the Aztecs and the Spanish. This handout, which by the way was designed by a teacher who said, I found a website that shows when iron showed up in different regions of the world. So we said, fine, here's the date and where it happened. And this can be an inquiry activity. You tell students what's the nature of the spread? You know, did it get independently invented in different places, or did it spread out from one place? And when you put it on there, it's a very classic flying geese pattern, a V-shaped pattern of spread out in different directions from one starting point. Except if you put the Greek in, that makes a little wiggle in the system because the Greeks got iron fairly early on, and then every place the Greeks went to establish a colony, they took iron with them. And you can see how iron showed up in the archaeological record just about the time the Greeks arrived, right there. This could be a Socratic question for your students. You know, you get this far, then I need to say this some point. Whenever we put a PowerPoint up on Giants, it's always too long. And there's a very simple reason for that. Your computer has a delete key, but it does not have a create key. And there are teachers who wanted us to have this written up in here. And there are other teachers that want this to be a place where they ask a question. If you want to ask a question here, feel free to erase this from the PowerPoint, show it up this far and ask the question. If you don't want to talk about iron at all, erase all the iron ones. And then we can get on to another question somewhere.
Phil, your delete key joke only works when you tell it. I have tried it to multiple audiences and they don't laugh, but everyone, I'm watching cameras right now, everyone chuckles when you do the delete key, create key joke. So it must be in my delivery.
Maybe a delete key's in order. So you could spend a bit of time asking students why iron took so long to get there. It is one of a dozen places where you can raise this point, but it happens to be a very simple place to raise this point. Technology does not exist in a vacuum. It happens in a particular place at a particular time. And that place is connected to other places in different ways. And in this particular instance, you need a whole bunch of other inventions, sails, compasses, ability to store food and water for a month and a half in order to make a connection across an ocean. So either they were going to invent iron independently over here, or they're going to wait until somebody finally has a good ship and could bring it over here about 1500. Here are some of the activity topics that are already written, and there will be hot links in Giants to the ones where they are appropriate, about alphabets and about iconic buildings and about world religions and things like that. So one more example, a shorter example, is that you can use a line to show a connection between different world regions instead of a blob. So Alexander could be drawn as a kind of a bridge between Europe and Central Asia. And a teacher had suggested these are what I would call the dirty dozen, the 12 big journeys that had the most impact on history. And if you plot them all, you know, they said Moses' journey was important, and Alexander's, and Hannibal's, and the Crusaders, and Columbus, and Kara Mustafa, and so on. This is another example of a place where if you take the names off, you've got yourself a wonderful test prep activity to say, okay, now who went all the way from Europe to China in the late 1200s? And why did that matter at that particular time? Now, you could put those bridges on the full geohistogram with all of the empires on it. And I would say that just gets way too cluttered and hard to read. That's where you give the student the geohistogram and have them start drawing on it. So we make the geohistogram in lots of different forms, but let me put the third geek note in. The shapes and colors that were chosen for most of these empires were chosen for a very important reason. The research supports that in terms of the saliency that it's got and the efficiency of visual search for particular kinds of things. So there's a reason for the colors. There's a reason for the shapes and for them being no more complex than they are, except in about 4 examples: the Greeks, the Chinese, the Byzantine Empire, and the European colonialism. So one last example, you can show specific events. This is another flying geese pattern about the spread of Buddhism. And you can do a compare and contrast. Why did Buddhism spread so much more slowly and not nearly as far as Islam did? And what's going on? And it's a great place for a writing activity for the student to suggest a hypothesis and then to cruise around in the clickable version in order to find things that might support that hypothesis. So the last use of the geohistogram is just to point at it for about 2 seconds. So when you show the movie about the Mongols, go to the geohistogram that's hanging on the wall and say, this is where they are. The student is going to be encoding that in a number of different ways. So you say, This is where they are. They're in the upper right corner. That means they're off to the east and relatively late in history. They're between the Song and the Ming dynasties. That's table number 3, by the way, on your game. Now we've got who they conquered from and who took it over China back from them. Or you could say they're about the same time as the Delhi Sultanate or the Aztec Empire in Central America. And now you're making the link across. In other words, if you just mention 1 or 2 of those things verbally, they will encode where and roughly when the Mongols were with a reasonable degree of precision. It's going to be good enough to separate whether they were at the same time as Mansa Musa or Martin Luther King. So it is a way to organize knowledge. You can transmit some kinds of knowledge through some of the hands-on activities, and we pay for good ideas for new activities, but there are about 23 activities at last count, including a very recent one about diseases and how diseases spread around the world, epidemics. It's valuable to use for just a few seconds to put other lessons in perspective. So you're done talking about whoever, Julius Caesar, point at it in the geohistogram. And parts of it can be used for test prep. So the rationale, again, the more engaging you make your video or your website or your game or your role play simulation, the more engaging your class activity is, the harder it is for the student to put it in perspective, because more of their memory is tied up in remembering how much fun it was. And when that happens, they won't remember where or when the Mongols were. So this is a way to help putting that information into the context of what else was going on. And you can do that either by saying it or by asking a question about it or having them write about it, or just having them mark it on their own geohistogram and give them a couple copies of it. So it's available as 8.5 by 11. It's available as 11 by 17, 3 different sizes of bulletin board posters, and an interactive electronic laboratory, which I hope I can find fairly easily here by clicking on that and that and that. Dave grabbed the geohistogram and said, I think I ought to make a clickable out of it. The next thing you know, there was a clickable made out of it. And the clickable has got things like some major turning points in history and where Alexander was and how Europeans spread around the world and claimed, got all kinds of this stuff. You can also put all the empires on. Or if you don't want something that's quite that complicated, you could do just 12 empires and put their names on them if you want. Start out with a simpler version, or 20 empires. Greece is over here because we talked about it, but all of the early civilizations are parked over here. I'm actually getting off into my next story already. Anything else I should point at over here? There's the spread of most of the religions. And how they started. So the Epic of Gilgamesh and Judaism and Christianity and Islam and Protestantism out here.
Phil, one of the things I like to do, if you clear the geohistogram, anytime I have been into a classroom where I have been asked to sort of demonstrate some of the things that you can do with it, I like to turn Egypt on and, point out, look at Egypt. I mean, you've got these blobs that show, you've got some larger portions of the blob that show it had more expanded influence, but I mean, that stretches basically from the bottom of the geohistogram to the top of the geohistogram. And then the thing that always blows the middle school kid's mind, why don't you turn on the United States layer? There you go. So in the grand scheme of world history, you know, you got lots of folks going Merca, but we haven't been around very long in the grand scheme of world history. And then if you turn the blobs for the 12 empires back on, you can see that we haven't even been around as long or as influential even as at least 12 other empires that are out there. So, you know, we may be considered the empire, you know, the way it's positioned at the top left of the geohistogram there, but when it comes to world history, we are not much. We haven't been around for very long, and that's always really eye-opening to the kids. So, and that literally takes 2 minutes to do and explain, and then you have a really good conversation with the kids about what that means, and it really helps solidify the purpose of the world geohistogram. So I just wanted to point that out because I've been in a lot of classrooms where I do just this, and then the hour's over because we've been talking for so long. So.
And I do one more like there to point out that the empires are there. This is a potentially printable version that you can give them, and then they can write the empire that we happen to be studying right now and put that name on. There's a set of the names on that are the major ones, and then to put all the minor ones on. So we've tried to make the geohistogram as flexible as possible, but the fact is you can't turn every single one of 70 empires on and off individually and still be able to find anything. You've even noticed that as familiar as I claim to be with this, I still have a hard time with hand-eye coordination and finding it in a dark room. So imagine if you had 140 buttons over here instead of just 40. So there have been some decisions made. That's pretty typical about most of the clickable maps. And yet almost all of the clickable maps have got a little bit of room for a couple more layers if you've got some really good ideas. And that was deliberate, you know, that we deliberately made sure that there would be just enough space to tack another 5 buttons on here somewhere. And color code, yeah. No, Dave is wiping his brow at this moment because he's the one that gets to do that. But,
no, the way you told the story, I just woke up one day and poof, there was a geohistogram available online. Like you neglected the hours of back and forth and the days of, oh goodness. Yeah. So yeah, please give us some new layers, guys. No, seriously, if you've got some good ideas, we'll make it happen.
Yeah. Which is Giants rule number 17-4. We got time to look at one quick example
yet? If it is quick, we are now right on time. So I'm slated to do the Unit 2 overview, but I don't need 10 minutes for that. So I'll give you 4.5.
4.5 you got. Anchor points is worth discussing. And while we're up here, this is very easy to do in American history. Ask them to come up with 5 dates that every kid ought to remember in American history. And it's just amazing. Group after group after group come up with 1776, 1492, 1861, 1929. You know, they come up with the same ones reliably. This is much harder in world history because there's so much more world history. So you can have them discuss what the geohistogram looks like as a quick review here if you want. And then we can talk about as 6 anchor points. And we came up with a sample set based on input from 2 groups of about 25 teachers each as to what might be 6 dates and times that every student ought to know. Just know automatically. We even wrote little poems, you know, along with in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and we made up poems for the other, and they're out there. But it really is valuable if you've got the time for you to have the students discuss and take ownership of what anchor points they want to remember. If they want to remember gunpowder as an anchor point, that's not bad. If they can remember when and where that happened. In any case, here's the anchor point. Caesar Augustus was in Rome, and that's just about right there. Hammurabi was the ruler in Babylon, about there. The guy who built the terracotta warriors and put China together right at the beginning as a worthwhile anchor point. So we'll put him over there. Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina in 622. That's year one of the Islamic calendar. That's probably a useful anchor point. It certainly changed the political geography of about half the world. So did Columbus change a chunk of geography, so we'll put him over there. And the largest empire in history was the one that the Mongols put together, so let's park them over there. My thought is that if students remember the dates and the times of those 6 anchor points, you can refer to other dates and times in relationship to that. So you could put them on all the empires, and you can see how many empires got ended or started by those anchor points. Or you can have them remember something else, like gunpowder was roughly halfway between the beginning of China and the Mongols, and in the same general part of the world, and so on. So, or you could say it was between the Tang and the Han Dynasty. In other words, you use the anchor points as a kind of a bridge to scale you up to the more complex diagram. But the students realize that if they remember things relative to the main anchor points, that'll make even the big diagram easier for them to remember, keep organized. So you could invent a sentence like that to describe the position of any historic event you want them to remember. And by the way, this works. So did that make it into 4.5 minutes? Because I'm calling it right there.
We're good, Phil. Any questions over the world geohistogram materials? One breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. All right, hearing none, although Sean McBrady just entered the waiting room. I'm going to steal screen sharing control and give you the Unit 2 overview. So that's the, well, this is the website software I use to update misocialstudies.org. The Giants link works now. This, back to our pacing view, which is what you want to see. Unit 2, you can see, is a slightly longer unit, and this one is really centered around, beginnings, the hunters and gatherers. One thing that we do is provide you, several weeks, roughly 3 weeks worth of instruction on this, as opposed to, I've seen others that spend a good chunk of the year here. And hunters and gatherers just aren't that interesting. Phil and I tried our best to fill a total 6-week unit on it, and we were bored after a week of doing all of the research. So we updated some of the things that the original authors had, and my job was to build some connective tissue. So let's get into the unit overview here. You can see the compelling question for this unit, and I did not bring this up with Unit 1 either, but every unit has a compelling question. How do ideas and inventions change history? Is our Unit 2 compelling question here. And I point that out because a lot of teachers, a lot of school districts rather, require teachers to have their learning targets on the board. And if there's one thing that grates my cheese or gets my goat or nails my tire, it's really low level. I can identify what a hunter and gatherer is style learning targets that just, you can Google that and poof, they've got the answer. There's no need to listen to you. So what I really like about the C3 framework, which we adapted with our standards, is this idea of compelling and supporting questions as your learning targets that are on the board. Now, I can't give you permission to do that if you're required to have them on the board. That's something to run by your administrator because some of them really like the low level. I can tell you who invented the cotton gin style learning targets on the board, but I prefer something a lot meatier. If I were back in the classroom right now, I would have for my entire unit, my compelling question up on the board for the whole unit. And I'd be swapping right underneath it. I'd be swapping as I go through the lessons, the supporting questions that go underneath it. And actually to give you, to make that even easier for you to do, most of our units we have posters that are usually available in PowerPoint format that you can download. I put these in PDF format. You know, these posters you can put, again, they're Spartan. You'll always be able to tell a Giants PowerPoint that Dave Johnson added, because there are very few pictures. It just gets the information across. They're designed for you to take and tweak and build into something you know, that you'd feel more comfortable delivering. I lack Phil's ability to, I have done Phil Gershmal PowerPoints for the first time in rooms full of 100 people, because they are that well put together that you don't have to be the expert to put them together. I lack his ability to create PowerPoints like that, but you can see we offer compelling question posters and supporting question posters, and I recommend you take and print these on legal size paper and poof, have these up on your board. If your principal is like, well, what content standard does that address? Well, we've got the coding underneath it. They're more than willing to look it up, but that's something that we have in all of the Giants units that I wanted to point out to you, since I did not point that out in my Unit 1 overview. Other things that get introduced for the first time in Unit 2, most units will have a unit student journal, and it's really just a Google Doc that they can take and make a copy of to record their thoughts. I say most units because there are some that don't have them, and there are some that don't have them for a very good reason. Unit 5 is a great example of this. When Phil and I sat down to write the World Religions unit, we foresaw two different ways that you could use it. You could either teach the world religions all as one big unit, and if that's the way you choose to do it, Unit 5 is your friend. But we also recognize that a lot of people wanted to teach each major world religion in the historical era in which it's introduced, because it made sense there. So some of the units will have a student journal and some of them won't. And that is the reason why, but most of them do. As well as those compelling and supporting questions posters. So those are things in all the units to take a look at. And as I am approaching the end of my time here, I did want to bring up a sample of one of my PowerPoints so you can see the difference. Again, not because it's the most beautiful thing ever. Like I said, it's very Spartan and, you know, add your own graphics to it, you know, do the, you know, change the stuff around. But as you can see, we do at least try to, oh, maybe this one is Phil's. Perhaps I wrote the wrong thing down. It was definitely an afternoon. Yeah, this is one of Phil's, so never mind. My examples on my PowerPoints and what they look like will begin with Unit 3 next month. But or this ancient inventions presentation, which definitely is mine, because as you can see when I pull it open, I use the standard blank background. But again, this is designed, these are supposed to be short, and they're the wisdom imparting mechanisms before you get into some of the fun activities that some of which Phil designed, some of which I designed that go along with this. So Unit 2 overall should take you about 3 weeks to get through. So it's going to be roughly a week per lesson. And I guess that also includes the assessment for Unit 1 and 2, which Roy, Becky, and I will talk about at the end of the night as one of the last things, because bonus, we've written assessments for you guys this year to use alongside this. So that's my Unit 2 overview. And with that, we're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts here. And I feel like I've been saying this a lot this evening, but this is where I'm going to kick it back to Phil for what we were calling when we were building the agenda, the Whitman sampler. And I told him I like the fruit flavored ones in particular. So if he could pick a few of those out, that would be great. But Phil, I'm kicking it back to you for whichever Whitman sampler items we landed on. So back to you.
Well, and I took a look at those initial frames. This will stop other screen sharing. Do I want to continue? Yes. I hope we have the words World History Map activities up there. Yes?
You know, I think everyone's along for the ride no matter what the agenda says. I'm just here to make sure that we end on time. So you're good.
Well, he said a Whitman sampler at first. And then I thought, the way he's got that set up, and like I say, those initial frames that he mentioned very quickly there as to what are some of the compelling questions over there. And we tried to look for themes that would permeate these units and help us tie these activities together. So what I put together for this 20-minute, 25-minute session here was to take a quick look at each of the activity, the map activities and the geohistogram activities that are in these first couple of units. Now, I sent out a handout that looks something like that, that I think Dave shipped around as a bunch of PDFs. So you don't need to take any notes on this, just relax, grab your cup of tea or whatever. What I thought that after having finished this rather sterile looking handout here is that you needed some look at what the visuals for each one of these activities looked like. So that's basically what this is, that we have an activity called eras on the geohistogram, because we really don't think that it makes sense to spend a whole lot of time explaining the geohistogram using that kind of PowerPoint when you can actually have the students do something historically important with the geohistogram. So each one of these activities has a very specific task, something that students do. And in this case, all they do is draw lines across the geohistogram and then label them with other than the Michigan standards, beginnings, early civilizations, classical empires, and then the one that only a grad student could love, expanding hemispheric interactions. The objective is for them to learn the time scale of the geohistogram, because you can evaluate whether they've got this or not from halfway across the room. It's a very easy thing for you to look at to see that they understand how to read the geohistogram. And they're going to learn the names of these things that may show up in the GLICs and in things like the My Open Book chapters and so on, where they use these phrases. They can also look very closely at the geohistogram under the heading Early Civilizations, and they can find Egypt, the Hittites, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley. In other words, it's a way of reinforcing what is meant by the word early civilizations or classical empires and so on. We already talked a little bit about the anchor points. They discuss the idea of an anchor point and then note the time and place of some key events. It can be our list, or it can be a list that you make up, or it can be a list that your class makes up after reading a chapter, and then decide what's the anchor point that I want to remember out of that chapter. The objective is that they learn and review the structure of the geohistogram, and they get the names of 6 anchor points. And again, it can be our 6 or it can be your 6. The whole point is it shouldn't be more than 6 or 7. Early human migration is a map activity. And basically all they do is draw arrows from big numbers to little numbers. So from the 9 to the 8, and then from the 8 to the 7, and then from the 7 to some 6s, and so on. They learn how to make a flowline map, and they take ownership of what is a really key map in early human history. Because we know when we tell them to study the map of human migration, they don't remember that. But here they're doing it, they're making it. And for this one, there's a PowerPoint that goes all the way through step by step and winds up with what the map ought to look like when you're done, which is basically the textbook map of early human migrations. Unit 1 had a how do historians look at the world activity called Caves on an Island. This is one where we found a story. We knew it was made for medical school. The story is, what do you do after you eat all the rats? And the students read that article. It's exactly 1 page long, like that. And then they classify 6 sentences as to whether that sentence is a statement of fact, whether it is an inference about how one fact might cause another, or whether it is a statement of a hypothesis that ought to be tested. The statements were pulled out of the article. And it's a way, basically, of reviewing both ELA and next gen science standards about the idea of facts, theories, hypotheses, and opinions, which, as we all know from the political discourse today, at least 40% of our American population has trouble separating facts, theories, opinions, and hypotheses at both ends of the political spectrum. So it's an ELA activity. It's a reading activity. It's a substitute, but it also is about an interesting corner of the world, how people got from Eurasia to Australia. Extinction of the megafauna is about hunters and gatherers, because one of the things we need to know about hunting is that hunting and gathering were self-extincting activities. In other words, when the hunters first showed up on a continent, life was great. And we can tell that from the archaeological record, because the people tended to be tall, their bones were so strong, they didn't have a lot of broken bones. We can look at the skeletons of people throughout history, and the early hunter-gatherers tended to live pretty well. And then they killed all the big dumb animals in their neighborhood, and life got a whole lot tougher for them. And we put together an activity about that. The activity basically involved just going out to Wikipedia and reading about saber-toothed tigers and giant sloths and other animals that don't exist anymore. We did make a teacher note spreadsheet to save you from having to go out and read all those articles. But you basically assign different students different animals to read about, and then they should summarize their research with each other, tabulate the results, and make a generalization. Because it turns out, when you look very carefully at the dates, is that the big dumb animals tended to die out within about 500 years of when humans first showed up in Australia, South America, North America, East Asia, and Europe, just to name a few continents. And in Africa, they are fast, smart animals that have lived with humans for a long time. So they speculate about the human hunting as a cause for extinction. Pastoral nomads, they basically watch a presentation and then they label a map that shows up in the presentation. And there are a couple of discussion questions at the bottom. There's a real reason for pastoral nomads being made into a presentation. They're reviewing the basic geography of grassland, forest, and tundra environments. And they put nomadic pastoralism into the time-space perspective. I hate to say this, but pastoralism was not transitioned from hunting and gathering to sedentary agriculture. It's a place where the Glicks are at best vague and at worst misleading on this score. We still have pastoral people in the world today, basically where they were. Sedentary agriculture tended to develop directly from hunting and gathering in different environments from pastoral economies. That becomes obvious when we look at domestication of plants and animals, and we look for an activity that would be kind of fun and make them look at that carefully, and came up with two of them. They've got two jobs. Job number one is to take a look at a burger, Happy Meal, or take a look at a pizza somewhere, and then just find out where all the ingredients came from. And it makes them look at this map fairly carefully to find out where tomatoes and beef and wheat for the crust and where all those things came from. Or problem number two is to design a menu that uses only foods that were domesticated in Africa, or only foods that were domesticated in South Asia or East Asia, and see what kind of a menu you're likely to come up with. And then you can compare that with modern menus to figure out, to what extent are Chinese restaurants truly authentic. We all know Italian restaurants aren't, because a heavy diet of pasta and tomatoes is using two crops that were not domesticated in Europe. Anyway, there is an activity about evaluating river valleys. It basically gives them a map with 20 river valleys that are numbered, lettered from A through T. And their job is to figure out, is that river valley likely to be too cold for agriculture, too hot, too dry, or maybe okay for farming? Simple, straightforward activity. Like I say, these activities aren't designed to replace your unit. They're just designed to be a very short supplement for your unit so that they'll remember that the river valley civilizations only had a few river valleys they could choose from. This is a review of basic climate and landforms, and it can have an extension to the Earth Environment's website if you need more review. How can a flood be good? Is going against a myth about the Nile River floods, that the Nile River flood was beneficial because it brought fertility to the land. That's exactly 180 degrees wrong. What made the Nile River flood valuable was that it removed salt from the soil. The soil was actually too fertile. It had too much fertilizer like potassium nitrate, ammonium nitrate, sodium chloride, calcium chloride, and so on. And the flood would remove some of that, and it would make the soil softer and a little bit less fertile. So we put together a PowerPoint about how can a flood be good. They watched that presentation, and you'd learn that river floods can be very beneficial for people in certain places and times. In fact, agriculture would have been impossible without the floods until you invented a tractor and a steel plow. And river civilizations is a very straightforward map activity where they just take a look at the river civilizations and try to write a generalization about where they are. Because what they learn is those civilizations developed in a very narrow range of latitude between the too hot, the too dry, and the too cold. That leads us to Indo-European languages. I misspelled that. I see it. I have to go fix it again. They view a presentation and then they mark a work map to show the spread out from the grasslands. And they learn about language as an indicator of past migration, especially if the conclusions are reinforced by DNA. And for you teachers, they show how the standards that name the 4 ancient civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, and South China, those standards are obsolete, as will become obvious when we actually look at that. So the summary, these map activities are designed to support, not to replace the lessons that you're already doing, the readings you already have in my open book about migration, about pastoralism, about early civilizations, domestication, hunting and gathering, and so on. The lessons are designed to reinforce each other and to build on activities that were done in earlier grades, like when we were talking about the camels. And the lessons are deliberately designed to use different engines. In other words, students do different things with these lessons. The main goal is to fit each topic with an approach that it's proved to be effective for that topic. The secondary goal is to enhance interest by adding some variety to the class. So they're reading one time, they're watching a presentation, they're looking at a map, they're arguing about whether humans killed off all the good animals and so on. So you don't have to use all the map activities. You can start slowly by trying just a few and adding as you see fit. But I'd like you to remember that they are designed to support each other as parts of a structured curriculum. So eventually we want to have the parts all hang together pretty well. And with that, these are the ones that we could take a look at. And I would open up the chat room if you've got a real strong preference. What I found out running this thing in other sections with other teacher groups is that the vote tended to be about 80% for Indo-European languages. So unless somebody screams loudly to the contrary, we're likely to look at Indo-European languages about right now. And I see Sarah's face on there. So are you screaming loudly or are you saying Indo-European?
Go ahead with the languages.
With any luck, that went into European languages. And this photo shows one edge of the steppes of Central Asia. Oh, I should warn you again, this PowerPoint is way too long, unless, of course, you want to use it. Oh, in other words, you've got a delete key, but you don't have a create key. And this PowerPoint was about half this long until about 10 teachers said, you really ought to have added something about this. And so I added it. So one teacher said, you really have to show us more maps about where these are. So the grasslands are north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and they stretch all the way from Europe to northern China. That turns out to be pretty important in history. The climate is cold and dry. It's very much like central Canada, which is also a grassland, a cold and dry grassland. Satellite image shows that the steppes are light green, because after we showed the maps, the teacher said, why don't you show us a satellite? Here you are. I added the satellite image. You don't want to put it in? Take it out. But it identifies what looks like a forest and what looks like a desert, just in case your students haven't looked at enough satellite images. The extent of the grasslands is easier to see on a simpler map, and this map is lifted out of the clickable map for grasslands. The question is, of course, why are we looking at grasslands in the middle of Asia? And the answer is because our language came from there, and a lot of important inventions that textbooks think were made somewhere else in the world, but weren't. And this is true whether we live in America, England, Germany, Spain, Italy, Poland, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, India, Australia. Those are all Indo-European languages. So the question is, how did this come about? And the answer, part of it, is that 7,000 years ago, in other words, just about the time that the very first people were putting seeds in the ground. Whoops.
There.
Okay.
Keep going, Phil. I got it. I got it. Yep.
Okay. Now, 7,000 years ago, there's some people living in places like just about right there, because that, in fact, is one of the old burial grounds of one of these people. And there were a lot of them there. There were about 8,000 people living in that particular place. In other words, that was the biggest city in the world at the time, or one of them. They lived in wooden houses. They gathered seeds and fruit from trees. They caught fish from streams. They hunted deer and horses in the grasslands. And for about 1,000 years, their population grew. Hunting became a whole lot harder after they killed off most of the big, slow animals, including 3 of the 5 species of horses. So they learned how to keep some of the other horses for milk and meat. So for about 1,000 years, a horse was a dairy cow when hunting wasn't so successful. That allowed the population to keep growing, and that made both hunting and herding became harder. They learned how to ride horses. And in order to do that, they had to invent a whole bunch of things like ropes and bridles and reins and saddles and things like that. And that allowed them to go a lot farther away from the river valleys. In other words, all of this land now became available for them to run their horses. They began to sell horses to people in other regions. And they were selling horses as far away as Mesopotamia and China and India, even back then. Then the climate turned a whole lot colder. And some of these people moved south of the Black Sea. We've mentioned them already deliberately. In other words, I'm trying to model within today's session exactly how we tie this stuff together, because some of these people that moved south of the Black Sea later on became known as the Hittites. They didn't invent iron, they brought iron with them from the steppe lands, along with the horses and wagons and other things that they had. Others moved way off to the east across some high mountains. They were called the Tatarians for a while. They lived as hunters, herders, and traders for a long time, going all the way back and forth between Central Asia and China. And then they mostly disappeared as a separate people. Some of them joined the Xiongnu, which was a horse riding group of warriors who were attacking China. Others, according to DNA, joined the Mongols, who were the horse riding warriors that attacked China and Europe. And we know where they invented horse riding, back in the steppe region. And about 3500 BC, the climate got a lot warmer, and the people learned how to just build wagons. And once they had a wagon, they could do the most important thing. They could carry water a long distance. And that made them go a lot farther away from the river valleys. And they became nomadic herders living out of wagons and camping for weeks at a time, which allowed their population to grow even more rapidly. And they spread out in a number of different directions. This is a real long story, but we're going to tell it very quickly and then let you put it on the map. Some of them moved northwest, and later on, according to DNA and language, they became German, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian. Some went west. They became the Celts, then the Scots, Irish, Welsh, then the Romans, Italians, French, Spanish, Romanians. Some went north. They became Ukrainian, Polish, Russian. Some went southwest. They became Greek, Serbian, Albanian. Some went southeast. They became Persian. In short, they became known by many other names, from Ireland to Russia, from Spain to India. So let's stop here in the year 2021. If these people were so important, why didn't we read about them in the book when we were studying ancient river civilizations? Because remember, Unit 1 is about how historians think, and this is a real good example of how historians think. There are 3 reasons why we didn't know about them, these people. Number 1, this was part of the Soviet Union, and it was almost impossible for a Western archaeologist to go there and study. It's also a very contested part of the world: Chechnya, Crimea, Ukraine, Caucasus. These are all places where people have been fighting for thousands of years. And the people built their houses out of wood and they lived in wagons. In other words, they're not leaving much of an archaeological record. They did not have the tools to carve temples out of stone. And there's a good reason for that. They didn't have any stone. I mean, there isn't any rock in that environment. They never tried to build a stone pyramid to last forever, and a dirt pyramid isn't going to do that. Well, yeah, actually it does. They built little pyramids called kurgans, which were burial mounds. Now, some of them aren't so little. That's a pickup truck right there. And it's real easy to think that's just a natural hill until you cut into it and you realize it's a burial ground for a city that was almost 50,000 people 500 years before Ur or Uruk in Mesopotamia. In other words, before the big cities in the Mesopotamian and Egyptian areas, these people were living in encampments, wagon cities that numbered in the tens of thousands. And people have been studying their graves in the last 20 years since the Soviet Union broke up and looking at what they have. So we've got an activity that I'm going to race right through. Chariots were invented by these people north of the Caspian Sea in southern Russia. This whole area is bigger than the United States. The weather's more like Canada. There are mountains, the Urals, there's a big desert, there's a forest that looks like Canada. There's a hardwood forest that looks like most of Michigan. And between the forest and the desert is this big grassland area. And one group of people in the grassland invented chariots about 2100 BC. And we made an activity about it. And the students would just basically circle all the ones and then the twos and colored a little lighter than the threes. This is the spread of the invention called chariots. And it arrived in Mesopotamia and Egypt about 500 years later, about the same time it came in China. In fact, the Chinese symbol for chariot is the same as some ones that were found in some carvings that were put inside these graves here, because the word for chariot is the same. So knowledge of chariots spread from Central Asia to Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Indus Valley. So when you see a picture like this, which is a carving in the Egyptian stone about the Battle of Kadesh, 1200 and something BC, where the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II fought the Hittites, you now know two really important facts. The Hittites originally came from the grasslands north of the Black Sea, and they brought chariots and wagons and horses along with them. And that both sides of the Battle of Kadesh bought chariots from the people that lived north of the grasslands. They didn't invent them in Mesopotamia or Egypt. And that's not the only thing these people invented. Their language spread with them as they moved to other places. And there's another map activity about that. Basically, it looks at what we mean by a spreading language. In ancient Indo-European, a wheel is a ruta, and an axle is an axe. And if you look at all these language, in India, in Hindi, it's rata and axis. In German, it's rad and axa. In Old Russian, in Portuguese, Spanish, French. Now, we've got the word wheel that we got from somewhere else, but we still have those old Indo-European words: round, rotate, rotary, radius, radial tire. All of that came from rasa. Now, I use just two words. Linguists have found a couple thousand words, and they've shown how they've spread out as those modern languages started one old language spoken by some horse herders in Central Asia. And as they moved away, you can talk about how languages change. I mean, we've added words for pizza and iPhone and so on. We've changed words. Hard rock, gay, and tweet do not mean the same thing than when my dad taught 7th grade. We've changed some spelling, and eventually the language, we just say it's a different language. If you want more archaeological information, there's a reference. If you want a DNA, there's some reference about that. And then I've got a newspaper here with some breaking news. Check the Giants website often, because there's a new version of the War Chariots activity that got finished last night about 11 o'clock, based on a comment from one teacher that said, you know, this activity would be more effective if we put it on the same map base that you use for some of the clickable maps. So we put it on the same map base as the clickable maps. And that puts me to the end of the slideshow about the Indo-Europeans. The message is there is not a glick about the Indo-European languages, because in fact, the glicks were written before a lot of this research was done, because this research is very new. But the research has been reinforced by DNA, linguistics, and archaeology, and the story is getting pretty solid. So, any questions about that story?
Absolutely pitch perfect timing, Phil. We are right at the next point in the agenda.
And like Dave said, theoretically, you should be able to look at these other PowerPoints and just go do them. And if you can't, you can complain to me about it and we'll fix it so that you can just go do it. So you got it.
All right. Well, those of you following along the agenda know we're at the last agenda item, which is both sad and exciting all at the same time, because let's face it, it's Wednesday and it's been a really long day. And here you are sitting through 3 additional hours of work today, listening to us. So the good news this time around is that we have some assessments available to go along with this. And this is practice that we introduced last year with the revised 6th grade units that we're carrying through for 7th grade. But there was one thing I wanted to say, and I can't remember what it is, so I'll come back to it when I get there. Becky and Roy, I want to invite you guys to come on and talk a little bit with me about the assessments while I pull it up on the screen here. So take it away, one or both of you. Well, preferably not in unison because that would be bad. Becky. You're muted.
Clicked on it twice. Okay, third time's the charm.
Third time.
The assessments that you're going to see tonight, particularly the first one, they may not look extremely extensive from the standpoint of like the number of items. And we didn't really perseverate on trying to have a lot of questions that were essentially asking the same kinds of things, right? When you take a look at what the objectives are for that first unit, again, the questions just mirror that. And Dave can kind of also speak to this, or Roy, if you want to, that's fine. But we also took some of the past items that have been written and we tweaked a few of those as well, because they were assessing what we were teaching in Unit 1. And there, we just didn't see the need to reinvent the wheel when it didn't need to happen. So, Dave, I'm having a hard time. I've got to get my screen to the point where I can see, each of the items. Okay. So like, for example, the very first one has to do with primary and secondary sources. I think we might have changed one or two of the markers that students had to drag. But again, you can see as you take a look at some of the other items, they may look very familiar if you have used any of the past items previously. Roy, did you want to say anything about those items? Or Dave, did you want to say anything about the geohistogram item that we have, which is number 4, I believe?
Well, just so you guys know, go for it, Roy.
I think one point to make, Becky, and you kind of headed in this direction, is two things: that the things that we're assessing are going to be practiced throughout the year. These are things students are going to be coming back to. And the items that we do have are a sampling. We can't possibly assess everything in the unit. And so there was some decision-making about what is the best sample of the content that we could gather some evidence from the students and infer, hey, they're on the right track. They've captured the understanding and carried it with them. The other thing to be aware of as you look at some of these items and see how they're set up is that you want to think about your formative assessment process as you're going through here and let that drive some of your formative assessment, those key pieces, because they are reoccurring skills that they're going to use later in the year, as well as using that content. So keep that in mind. It's a sampling and it's not meant to cover everything, but it's enough for you as a teacher to gather some evidence to go, hey, they're on the right track.
All right, and I just wanted to point out too that these are built in Google Slides, and the question themselves we saved as the template, so it's a lot harder for the kids to edit those. Doesn't mean that they can't or won't, but I mean, you'll recognize it immediately because, yeah, kids. And so the things that they can actually manipulate are, the markers, which they can drag and go from there. So you guys have view only rights to these. And that's because we want you to only view them. So, you'll be able to make a copy though, and you'll be able to change these up. You can see we've got, drag the circle here for, is this a compelling question or a supporting question? You know, the kids will drag and then type your answer here. That opens up in a text box. So in a lot of ways, the 6th grade teachers last year figured these questions out, or they figured out the delivery for us. And we just copied their good work with the 7th grade spin. Now you do have access to the folder, and you know we're always working a couple of weeks ahead of the sheriff. So you can see that there's a file in the folder called Unit 3 Assessment Draft. And that is a draft because we haven't gone through and done our final edits as a team yet. You know, and right now I'm working on those in tandem after school and you know, things like that. So, you know, we've got about 20 questions on the Unit 3 assessment, which is almost 10 more than we have on the Unit 1 and 2 assessment. But remember what we said at the beginning of this, Units 1 and 2 are both very, very short units. You know, they're not designed to take so if you do get ahead, you can see what we're working on. Just know that if it still has the word draft on it, we're not done and we haven't given it our final looks yet and run it through all the lenses that we run it through. So just be forewarned, but the very first assessment has 11 questions. They're not 11 questions that your kids are going to be able to answer in 5 minutes. It's still going to take them a chunk of a class period to get through them. It's a mix of drag and drop style questions and multiple choice and essay and all of the above. So you've got a little sampling of all of it there. And we are just happy that Phil and I were able to rewrite the units last year so that this year we can focus on rolling them out and building some good assessments to go along with them. So I do remember what I wanted to say to kick this off. So I will ask about questions about our questions. That's meta in just a moment. But what I wanted to point out was we got word this afternoon that a bunch of you did not get the emails that I sent out this week. And I sent them out again. And then I finally sent the Google Doc agenda separately and gave you guys editing rights to that. I wanted you to know, I don't know what happened with that or why some of you didn't get it. I did send them because Roy and Becky got them every time I sent them. But I had a similar thing happen with a superintendent that I have to work with quite frequently on some budget stuff. So I don't know what it is, if it's a Google thing, if it's a Dave Johnson email thing, but we are treating tonight's agenda as a running agenda. So we're going to add future sessions to the same document that I shared with you tonight. So you might want to pin it or create a folder, and you know, I will definitely share it out the day of too as a just in case, but we don't know why the email didn't make it to you. So just know that this agenda will always get you back here. So save it, star it. If you're not familiar with starring, you can, you know, you can add a shortcut to it to your drive and then hit star, and in your Google Drive, you can just go to your starred items and poof, everything that you've starred is there. Except for the thing that I literally just, nope, there it is. Okay, so, you know, keep this agenda handy because we're going to, you know, September 29th is going to become pages 10 and 11 by the time we're done with it. And the most recent one will always be up here, but it'll always have your Zoom link and your Sketch application, the link out to Giants, the link out to the Social Studies Hub that someone asked for tonight, and a link to the assessment folder. So star this because we're not going to create a new document. But I will share it the day of as a just in case because I don't know what happened. So that's a really long story about something being wrong with my Gmail that I made you all sit through. Thank you for reading my essay and coming to my TED Talk. With that, I will ask you guys if you have any questions at all about the assessment pieces that we're putting together to go along with this.
As you think about looking at these assessments, we don't necessarily have an answer key for those extended writing. It'd be great if we had the time to develop potential student responses or have test driven these assessments and gathered a bunch of student responses and put them in kind of a performance indicator table to give you an idea of the spread of answers that are allowable. So as you give these, one recommendation is you're going to kind of have to come to the conclusion of what is your range of acceptable answers on the written responses. And I would capture the really good ones that come in from your students this year to help build that performance indicator response spread. So in the future, you have a better idea of the type of responses you want students to generate their evidence of learning.
Well, a whole 15 minutes early, we're to that last part of the agenda, which is a kickback over to Becky again I feel like tonight I've shuffled papers around the office. Like, okay, we're going over to this corner of the office with this stack of papers and Bill's going to take them. We're going over here and Becky's going to take them. Becky, what are the final reminders and things like that everyone needs to know before we send them off for the evening?
The only thing is just the SCECHs. We verify the attendance using the chat box and noting who we have for each session. So that's how we verify. But at the end of the series, the night that we have our last session, I'll remind everyone again to just complete that form. And then I'll give you again the email address that you can send it to. And then Mandy will get everything entered in. But aside from that, I think that's it. We've got the master spreadsheet with everyone's names and email addresses. And so we should be all set to go.
And there is one person signed on tonight as iPhone. And we don't know who you are. So when we pull the logs tonight, it's going to say iPhone. So if you could tell us who you are or type it in the chat, well, you're on the iPhone, so you may not be able to do that. But if you could unmute and tell us who you are so we can capture that, that would be awesome, especially if you're going for the sketches. But there's no need to hold everyone else up while we wait for that one. So go ahead and have yourselves a great evening. I believe we're back here on October 27th. It's sometime towards the very end of October, so it's only about 4 weeks, but we should be caught up with you by then, or you guys should be caught up with us by then. So awesome. Okay. And thank you, Sean, for solving that mystery. We ripped off the mask and it was Old Man Jenkins. Who would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for those meddling kids and that dog. So have a great night, everybody, and we will see you back here in October.